Let us begin by looking straight into the nature of the problem without any diplomatic coding, because history has taught us that ambiguity is the greatest enemy of strategy. And when looking at what has unfolded in Venezuela in recent days, I see a tactical shift that is incredibly interesting, yet full of risk between the White House and the State Department. When President Trump declared that the United States would run Venezuela, that was an instinctual statement demonstrating raw power projection. But immediately after, we saw Secretary of State Marco Rubio step out to recalibrate this message in a more sophisticated manner, shifting from the concept of occupation to the concept of coercion, emphasizing that we have no intention of establishing an occupation authority like the one the George W. Bush administration put in place in Baghdad, but instead maintaining a military quarantine on oil exports to create political leverage. This adjustment is not merely a matter of semantics, but it reflects the unvarnished truth that the United States does not want to shoulder the burden of managing a failed state, but only wants to control its economic lifeline to force the current leadership to submit. And this is the core of realism, where national interest is placed above visionary nation-building ideals. We must analyze this strategy called quarantine or blockade more deeply, because this is effectively economic warfare at the highest level, where United States naval forces, which have been deployed on a scale unprecedented in modern history in the Caribbean, are executing missions to prevent oil tankers from entering or leaving Venezuela. The objective here is not to protect the Venezuelan people from poverty, as the flowery rhetoric in the media suggests, but the true objective is to paralyze the regime's ability to generate revenue, choking off the financial resources of those in power, thereby forcing them to open the oil industry to foreign investment, and naturally, the priority will belong to American companies. When Secretary Rubio speaks of using this tremendous amount of leverage until we see changes, he is sending a cold message that the suffering of the Venezuelan economy is an acceptable price to pay to achieve the energy security and geopolitical interests of the United States. And we must admit that on the international chessboard, oil is always the grandest prize, the driving force behind military intervention decisions, regardless of the human rights or democracy justifications often presented to soothe the public. Looking back at the history of United States intervention in Latin America, we see the shadow of 19th century gunboat diplomacy returning powerfully and without concealment. And this is clearly demonstrated through high-ranking officials not hesitating to declare that the Western Hemisphere is the backyard of the United States, where we will not allow competitors like Russia or China to establish bases of operation. This brutal candor from Secretary Rubio, when he asserts that this is where we live and we will not accept the presence of adversaries, has wiped away decades of diplomatic efforts to convince the world that the United States is not a colonial power. However, the risk of this approach is extremely high, because when we publicly apply this sphere of influence mindset, we are inadvertently legitimizing similar actions by major rivals like China and Russia in their own regions, creating a dangerous precedent that opposition senators have warned could turn the entire region against us. And worse, it could incite a fiercer race for geopolitical influence, where powers do not hesitate to use force to protect their so-called backyards. The oil issue in Venezuela is not merely a business matter, but it is an equation of energy security and global strategic competition. As we know, that China is currently the largest foreign investor and buys up to 80% of the country's oil exports, while Russia also holds significant stakes. The current United States strategy is to use military power to sever this flow, forcing Venezuela to return to the Western orbit. And we see this intention clearly through Secretary Rubio and President Trump repeatedly mentioning the need to reinvest in the Venezuelan oil industry through private Western companies. The fact that the Chevron Corporation was granted a license to operate as an exception amidst a forest of sanctions is not a coincidence, but a carefully calculated move to maintain an American presence and be ready to take over when the opportunity arises, because the harsh reality is that the current administrative apparatus in Caracas no longer has the capability to operate this industry. And Washington believes that only American capital and technology can revive that black gold mine, naturally accompanied by the harsh political conditions that we call security guarantees. We also cannot overlook the military and intelligence aspects of this campaign, particularly the Delta Force raid to capture leader Nicolas Maduro, an act that was bold but also fraught with legal and diplomatic risks, justified under the name of law enforcement against drug crimes. Although the administration emphasizes that this was not an invasion but a police operation, deploying special forces into the territory of a sovereign nation, causing significant casualties to opposing security forces, with estimates rising to 80 dead, according to the Venezuelan side, is clearly an undeclared act of war. The justification of fighting narco terrorism, while sounding reasonable to the domestic public when looked at through actual intelligence data, shows that Venezuela's role in the global drug supply chain is limited, and the country does not produce fentanyl, the drug that is the top concern for the United States, which suggests that the drug allegation is merely a convenient pretext to legitimize regime change by force, a familiar tactic we have seen many times in the past. Another notable point in current strategic thinking is how the United States is handling leadership personnel in Venezuela after Mr. Maduro was captured, as we see an interesting contradiction between words and actions. Although publicly supporting opposition leaders like Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado, even calling Mr. Gonzalez the rightful president and campaigning for Ms. Machado to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, in reality, at the negotiating table, Washington is applying pressure on Ms. Delcy Rodriguez, the person holding actual power, President Trump's threat that she will pay a bigger price than her predecessor if she does not do what is right, along with Secretary Rubio's statement that we will assess based on actions rather than words, reveals a cold pragmatism. The United States is ready to work with anyone, including former enemies, as long as they submit and serve American interests, specifically opening the oil sector. This is a rudimentary lesson in international relations, where democratic principles often have to yield to core interests, and the fate of opposition leaders is sometimes just a pawn on the negotiation table to pressure the ruling regime. The escalation of tension at sea is also an aspect that needs careful analysis, as the United States Coast Guard and Navy are not only intercepting ships on the sanctions list, but also pursuing ships that switch flags, creating situations of direct confrontation with nuclear powers like Russia. The incident of the oil tanker changing its flag and the formal diplomatic intervention from the Russian Foreign Ministry is a clear warning signal that this conflict is no longer confined within Venezuelan borders, but risks spreading into a major international crisis. Intercepting vessels in international waters is always a high risk action, easily leading to military miscalculations. And when we hear military officials assert they will continue attacks on suspected boats despite legal controversies and casualties, we must ask ourselves if we are stepping into a new quagmire without a clear exit strategy. Toughness is necessary, but uncontrolled toughness can lead to irreversible consequences, especially when the adversary is not just a weak state, but the great powers standing behind it. Finally, we must look back at this entire picture with the necessary sobriety and skepticism of intelligence professionals to see that behind the declarations of freedom and democracy is a fierce battle for resources and geopolitical influence. The United States is betting heavily on using overwhelming military and economic power to reshape the order in its backyard, accepting the risk of diplomatic isolation and inciting long-term hostility in the region. The warning that Cuba could be the next target also shows that the ambition of this campaign does not stop at Caracas, but is an effort to redraw the political map of all Latin America. However, as someone who has lived through many wars and witnessed many perfect plans collapse when colliding with reality, I must remind you that the cost of intervention is often much higher than initially estimated, and forcing a nation to its knees may bring a short-term victory, but it also sows the seeds of long-term instability that the next generation will have to bear, and that is the burden of power that we must never forget. Sir, the short answer is no. We are not done yet. With a geopolitical file as complex and containing as many explosive risks as Venezuela, what I have just presented is merely the surface of a massive submerged iceberg, and if we stopped there, it would be a serious omission in strategic thinking. To truly comprehend the full picture of what is transpiring inside the Oval Office and at the Pentagon, we need to continue dissecting deeper into the technical military aspects, the reactions of rival superpowers, and the economic trap the United States is setting. So please sit down and continue listening to my next in-depth analysis. We need to speak more clearly about the concept of lawfare that the administration is using to justify its military actions, because this is an extremely dangerous precedent in modern international relations. When Senator Rubio argues that using Delta Force to capture a foreign head of state does not require congressional authorization because it is a law enforcement operation rather than a war, he is playing a risky game of semantics. Let us look at the naked reality. We send our most elite soldiers equipped with heavy weaponry, infiltrating sovereign territory, engaging in firefights, and causing the deaths of dozens of people to capture the head of that state. And if any other nation did the same to the United States, we would not hesitate to call it an act of war. Labeling the adversary with drugs or terrorism is a classic intelligence card to bypass international legal barriers and internal control processes, but it creates a new standard where national borders become meaningless before the arrest warrants of a great power. And I worry that our adversaries will learn this lesson very quickly to apply it in reverse against us or our allies in the future. Let us shift to the angle of superpower competition, where the story of the oil tanker Bella One changing its name to Marinera and flying the Russian flag is not just a thrilling anecdote on the high seas, but a red alert regarding the risk of direct conflict between nuclear powers. The incident of the United States Coast Guard pursuing a commercial vessel protected by the flag of Russia right in international waters is a scenario we always feared throughout the Cold War era, because the line between enforcing sanctions and military provocation is incredibly thin. When the Russian Foreign Ministry formally demanded the United States stop the pursuit, they were not just protecting a ship, they were drawing a red line regarding national prestige. And if a captain of one of our Coast Guard cutters opens fire or executes a mistaken boarding action, we could find ourselves dragged into a top-level diplomatic crisis where miscalculations could lead to uncontrollable escalation. This is no longer an internal Venezuelan matter, but a place where Washington is testing Moscow's endurance limits right in its own backyard waters. And history shows Russia is not a nation that easily backs down when its national pride is publicly challenged. Beside the Russia factor, we cannot fail to mention the elephant in the room, which is China, because Beijing's massive economic presence in Venezuela is the very silent driver fueling Washington's eagerness for regime change. When intelligence data indicates that private Chinese companies are purchasing up to 80% of Venezuela's oil exports, we understand that Beijing holds the energy lifeline of this nation, and that is unacceptable to American strategic thinking in the Western Hemisphere. This blockade is not just aimed at Maduro, but the further goal is to cut off this cheap energy supply to China and force these strategic oil and gas assets to be transferred back to Western corporate management. This is a resource war in the literal sense of the 19th century, where the flag follows trade. And we are seeing a massive geoeconomic coercion effort to push Chinese influence out of Latin America, a gamble that, if failed, will push Venezuela and the entire region deeper into Beijing's arms as an anti-American fortress. Returning to the internal issue of Venezuela, I want to analyze more closely the shift from the intention to run to the intention to coerce that Secretary Rubio skillfully executed, as it reflects a belated but necessary realization of the limits of American power. To run Venezuela means we would have to be responsible for electricity, water, health care, security, and food for millions of desperate people, a financial and logistical burden that even the United States economy would buckle under, not to mention the risk of getting bogged down in a prolonged urban guerrilla war. By choosing the coercion solution, Washington is applying a strategy that is crueler but safer for itself, choking the economy so that the people and the Venezuelan military have no choice but to revolt or surrender, pushing the humanitarian responsibility and chaos onto the current administration to solve. We are telling Ms. Rodriguez and her generals that you can keep your seats, but you will have no money unless you do as we say. And this is a type of geopolitical blackmail where the suffering of the people is used as leverage to achieve political compromises at the negotiating table. We also need to look further south to the island of Cuba, because in the minds of people like Secretary Rubio, Venezuela and Cuba are not two separate issues, but two ends of the same rope. The fact that Mr. Rubio did not deny the possibility that Cuba could be the next target and asserted that the Cuban government is in huge trouble reveals a much broader ambition to use the momentum of victory, if any, in Venezuela to create a domino effect, collapsing the last fortress of socialism in the Caribbean. This strategy relies on the assumption that Venezuela is the udder nourishing the Cuban economy through subsidized oil shipments, and when this supply is cut, Havana will fall into crisis and collapse. However, the history of the past 60 years has proven the incredible survival capability of the Cuban regime against embargoes, and underestimating the adversary is always a fatal mistake of American policymakers, not to mention that cornering both nations simultaneously could create a desperate survival alliance ready to execute asymmetric actions that destabilize the entire region. Another aspect that few dare to speak straight about is the risk of weaponizing the international financial and trade system, something Senator Warner warned about weakly but accurately. When we use sanctions tools, naval blockades, and asset seizures arbitrarily based on unilateral national interests, we are destroying the rules-based order that we ourselves painstakingly built after World War II. Other nations are watching and taking notes carefully. Today it is Venezuela's ship, tomorrow it could be their ship, today it is oil, tomorrow it could be semiconductors or rare earths. This will accelerate the process of de-dollarization and the formation of parallel trade blocs separated from the Western system, weakening the very soft power of the United States in the long run. We are trading the stability of the global system for a short-term tactical victory. And as someone who always looks at the big picture, I must ask if that price is worth it. Finally, let us speak about the human element in our military and intelligence apparatus, the people who are having to execute these orders in silence. Deploying the largest naval force in modern history in the region and maintaining a state of high combat readiness requires massive resources and places extreme stress on sailors and soldiers. They are operating in the gray zone between peace and war, where rules of engagement can change by the hour and the pressure to make life or death decisions in a split second is immense. We have seen soldiers injured by hostile fire, and although there were no fatalities, that is a reminder that American blood is being spilled for political calculations. The responsibility of a leader is to ensure that sacrifice must serve a clear and achievable goal, not a vague military adventure with no end. And I fear we still do not have a satisfactory answer to the question. What happens after the regime collapses?